Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on its response to the Climate Change Committee's reports, Progress in Reducing Emissions in Scotland 2022 report to Parliament and Scottish Emissions Targets First Five-Yearly Review.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
Scottish Ministers will take the appropriate time to consider the recommendations from the Climate Change Committee's advice and respond in the spring. We will work closely with the Climate Change Committee as part of our continuous review of policy to ensure we benefit fully from their expertise, whilst progressing delivery and considering possible new actions. The Committee's advice will also support development of the next climate change plan, which will be published in full later this year.
Liam Kerr.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, but the committee said that SNP targets weren't accompanied by deep thinking about policies and rather accused ministers of magical thinking. Now, clearly, this portfolio must be prioritised, but I've discovered the Scottish Government has only 6 people working on its Climate Justice Fund, whilst just 4 are dealing with the Loss and Damage Fund announced at COP27. Compare that with the 25 civil servants working on an independence prospectus costing £1.5 million a year. And this government's skewed priorities are very clear. So will the Cabinet Secretary be taking steps to realign government resources away from the manufacture of grievance and division and instead direct it towards delivering practical priorities to address the climate emergency?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we always deploy staff within the civil service to make sure we take forward our areas of policy priority, and that's why Scotland's emissions are down by well over 50% on the 1990 baseline, which takes us over halfway and, of course, has us ahead of other parts of the UK in addressing climate change. And what I can assure the member is that we will continue to take forward a range of policies to tackle the issue of climate change, to ensure we do so in a fair and just way. And I would gently point out to the member, we certainly won't tackle climate change effectively if we're opening up new coal mines.
Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Climate Change Committee report recognises key policy areas, for example, in industry and electricity supply sectors, are reserved to the UK Government. So to what extent is meeting our net zero targets here in Scotland reliant on decisions taken by the UK Government, and how is the Scottish Government working with the UK Government to ensure that our ambition in Scotland are matched by the rest of the UK?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there's a range of areas that, of course, are the responsibility of the Scottish Government, and we take them seriously and pursue policies to make sure we deliver on our climate change, our statutory climate change targets. But there are also areas which are reserved to the UK Government that have a direct impact on climate change policy here in Scotland. In the energy sector in particular, for example, negative emission technologies play an extremely important part in helping to make sure we meet our climate change targets here in Scotland and actually across the whole of the UK, which is why taking forward carbon capture and the Acorn project is mission critical not only to Scotland's climate change targets, but also to the UK's climate change targets. And any further delay in making a decision about supporting something like CCUS and the Acorn project just creates uncertainty, risk around employment, a lack of investment in key areas, and places a greater burden in other policy areas, which is why we need the UK Government to step up to the plate and show leadership in this area and give the go-ahead to the Acorn project here in Scotland.
Mercedes Vialba.
Very grateful to the Presiding Officer for taking the question. If we are to meet our national target of reducing car mileage by 20% by 2030, reliable, affordable and readily available public transport will be key. One of the Climate Change Committee's recommendations to achieving this is to invest in sustainable forms of transport, yet the Scottish Government is proposing widespread service cuts to Scotland's railway. So will the Minister think again and rule out service reductions to demonstrate his government's commitment to Scotland's railway to protect jobs and to reduce transport emissions?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I do recognise that access to good public transport is an important part of helping to get people out of their cars into public transport, which is why we've been making significant investment in our railways in order to decarbonise them. We're now at the point where I think over 75% of all journeys on Scotland's railways are actually in electrified routes, which has been decarbonised as a result of the investment this government has made, and why we've made significant significant investment in helping to decarbonise the bus system by actually investing in, through grant schemes, to support the electrification of the bus network through electric buses, which are now being rolled out. And I'm sure the member would also recognise we're now at the point where almost 50% of people in Scotland actually travel on our bus network for free, as a result of the concessions travel scheme that we have for those that are over 60 and for those who are under 22. I'm sure the member would welcome that as an example of showing leadership and encouraging people onto our public transport network.